Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking with myself, Ed Wootton, and my co-host, Liam Pape.
Hello.
This week, Liam, we're talking about bereavement. Obviously, it's something that happens to everyone, but something that doesn't happen to everyone is that they're bereaved as a result of negligence or an injury or something that basically someone could be held, I suppose, at fault is the word I would use, or the phrase I would use. And in those cases, sometimes our teams, our negligence teams, basically help those people through the legal process of, seeking financial compensation when that kind of thing has happened. But obviously, there's a whole lot of different things and that can come up, feelings, obviously in a stressful time, as an emotional time during bereavement that we wanted to kind of talk about. So we got Ali Cloak, who's a specialist in inquests and fatal claims, and she spoke to Nikki di Taranto, who's a consultant psychiatrist, they had a really in-depth conversation about this very tricky topic.
Indeed. So this podcast is, of course, called Legal Thinking. But in this conversation, I think some of the most interesting elements that were spoken about were actually the emotional part of making a claim and kind of the thought process that claimants go through before making it and deciding whether they want to. What Nikki does a really good job of here is kind of going into the ins and outs of the way people feel before they make a claim and during the claim. And Ali does a fantastic job of explaining the claim process, but also kind of the emotional intelligence which is needed by lawyers to conduct that as well.
So let's roll the tape, as it were.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry, just to introduce you, Nikki. As a psychiatrist, what are the issues that kind of come up in the course of the claim that people need to work through? I think normal grief and beyond that kind of thing.
Well, just on the issue first of sort of the effects on the individual of bringing a claim, whether it's in a situation of bereavement or whether it's something else, some other traumatic or unpleasant event in your life, it's definitely very double-edged in that the experience of bringing the claim can be very distressing for an individual. They have to obviously relive traumatic experiences, and the big factor of being told often by the experts who are giving reports in the case that, this could have been prevented, whatever it was that happened. In all personal injury cases, that's going to be a factor, because obviously if you're taking your case forward, you're being told something could have been done differently. And that can be very distressing and can actually trigger, mental health issues in the person. It's a big factor, and it's something which sometimes actually quite perturbs me, that I'm often, when I'm interviewing or examining a person in the context of a personal injury claim, I'm actually re-traumatizing them. And, that can be quite an ethical consideration as to how much you push them in terms of, obviously you have to ask them about what happened and take them through the traumatic event, whatever it was. And that is something, you have to sort of, I guess, use clinical judgment as to how far you push them in that, in order to try not to make things worse for them. But obviously it's important for them to be able to progress their claim as well. So that is a bit of an ethical factor in such cases. Yeah, absolutely.
And in your experience, though, do you find that the process of getting the answers, even if it does demonstrate that things could have been done differently and the death was avoidable, do you think that it perhaps helps with prolonged grief to find out who was responsible and hold them to account?
I think it's very individual, and it differs from case to case, because you also, of course, I'm usually meeting people once or twice in the course of their claim, and I don't get to see what happens to them later after the claim is finished and they get on with their lives, and hopefully sometimes with some therapy. But I think it's quite individual, because almost invariably people tell me, I'm not doing this for the compensation. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing it because I want justice. I'm doing it because I want this never to happen to somebody else. I'm doing it because the organization that let me down needs to change. And I think people, if they are successful in litigation, probably do find then that they can, a lot of people find that they can move on if they get, the answer and so on. And of course, although people say they're not in it for the money, of course, money can help with things like getting therapy, which is incredibly difficult to do on the NHS, but, you can then pay for decent quality therapy. So, I think it is individual, though, and I have seen people in personal injury claims who've been absolutely, their mental health has deteriorated terribly during the course of making the claim. So it's a double-edged sword. You want people to make claims where something's gone wrong. You want, organizations to be held to account for mistakes, but there is a cost to the individual for doing that. So it's very individual, though. I mean, some people find it therapeutic to bring the claim and to find the answers and of course.
That's what I was going to ask about, Nikki. I particularly with the inquest process, I find that families are really sort of driven or motivated by the feeling that they're doing something useful, that they're potentially changing processes, and they'll often speak to doing it in so-and-so's memory or sort of in their honor, or and that seems to be a real motivating factor. And I don't know whether that's, partly distraction, partly, it may well actually be unhelpful from your point of view, but it's definitely a theme of the families that I work with.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, practically every personal injury case I do, the people are saying, I want this not to happen to somebody else, and they have at least part of their motivation is exactly that they are doing it for a greater cause, not just for themselves and their family. And I think that does, for a lot of people, that does kind of offset the distress and actual, mental disorder that sometimes causes them, but not always. And I have seen people where it's actually been very damaging, and I have seen people where it's been extremely therapeutic. I mean, I think on the whole, people probably do find it helpful to their mental health in the end, but it's a difficult process to go through. But I mean, it's an important thing for society. It's not just about the individuals. It's about holding organizations to account, and people do find that helpful. Yeah.
And you mentioned funding the cost of therapy, which is obviously really important if someone needs that help. But it also springs to my mind, the sort of wider anxieties about financial concerns. So where a household has lost, someone that was contributing financially, the, broader anxiety about how they're going to sort of cope and, get on with their lives without that income, must be a massive additional stressor. And so although it can take a while before a claim results in a settlement, but that in itself must bring alleviate a massive burden.
Yes, I mean, of course, when people have actually, lost out financially through a personal injury, obviously, sort of having the means to get on with your life is going to help their mental health in the longer term. But obviously, as I said, going through the claim can be very stressful for people, and in a case where there's been a particularly traumatic event, you're going to reawaken, traumatic memories and so on. And you can, I often tell the person they may need some extra support while they're going through the litigation process. And then they may feel some relief at the end of it. But yeah, of course, you don't want to discourage people, because it's very important that they do get what hopefully will be helpful to them at the end, in terms of obviously compensation, but also therapy, which is incredibly difficult to get these days on the NHS.
And I was going to ask what we can perhaps do to mitigate some of that harm along the way.
It's important that people realize that you and me as the psychiatrist and everybody else involved, that that it's stressful and difficult for them, and that it's okay if they feel that it's it's very overwhelming and very difficult, and that's normal. Sometimes people feel guilty that they are finding it overwhelming. They're finding it very difficult to to go forward with the litigation. And you see people who, they take the solicitor's letters and they tell me about, they can't open the solicitor's letter, they won't open the email for a while, and they'll find it very difficult. And it's important to normalize that and explain to people that what they're going through is completely normal. And I find if I'm examining somebody and I find they actually are suffering from an actual mental disorder, be it a prolonged grief reaction, be it post-traumatic stress disorder, be it other kinds of, mental health issues, that you actually point that out to them, and that is normal, that is, that they are actually suffering from something that is identifiable, and that they might want to seek, if they're not already seeking help, that they might want to seek help for that. To sort of, to normalize it, to make them realize that this is a normal reaction. If you've been traumatized, or if you've lost something, or if something bad has happened to you and you are now suffering from mental health issues as a result, or partly as a result of that is a perfectly normal thing, and that there are names for these conditions. We have treatments for these conditions, and that also, that if they were to seek treatment, even during the course of the litigation, that is not going to damage their claim at all, because people sometimes worry that they should wait until the claim's finished before they seek treatment, and it's very important that people are supported while they are going through the process, especially as it often takes a long time. And people's mental health does suffer. So definitely to normalize it, to explain to them that this is something, I'll often say this is, what you're going through is something I see a lot in people who are bringing claims about traumatic events. And, there's a name for this. It's post-traumatic stress disorder, or it is a bereavement reaction, or whatever I, consider it to be. And the treatment will be, and explain to them what treatment is available. And even if they can't get the treatment immediately, for example, if they're on an NHS waiting list and, they're not going to get it within the next couple of months, and they aren't, and there's not going to be an interim payment for a while or whatever, so they're not going to get it, to explain that at some point in the future, treatment is going to alleviate your distress to a degree. So that's very important to give people hope as well.
I was just thinking in terms of some of the practical steps that I always sort of try to bear in mind, because I think, as Nikki said, it's so individual specific, and there'll be some clients who call me up as soon as I've got in touch with them and they want to discuss it for for a while and go through every sort of question, every detail. And then I have, at the opposite end of the spectrum, clients who I know they won't want to open my email for a long time, and I'll sort of I'll give them a heads up in the email as to sort of whether they need to read it soon or not, so they can, decide when they feel most comfortable to try and, read whatever it is. Or perhaps if it's disclosure in the inquest, it can sometimes be a really large amount of documents with really difficult content in it. And so I think tailoring it to the specific person is something I definitely try to do, just to bear in mind their preferences on how they try to process it, particularly when you're sending out documents that you think are going to be difficult for them to grapple with.
Yeah, so it's definitely something you guys take into account.
Yeah, and I think some people want to be really heavily involved and want to sort of understand all the detail intricately, and then other people really want to take a bit of a back seat, and they sort of see it that they've brought you in so they don't have to deal with so much of the burden. So there's a huge disparity in what people sort of seek from the process and how involved they feel they need to be to achieve their objectives.
As legal professionals, what would you suggest to people who may be going through this process to try and understand that they've got the right solicitor that's actually going to take these kind of things into account? What do you think would be the red flags or something like that? That's you maybe not got the right person, or that trying to reword it the other way more positively would be the positive sign. I think
generally there's a really good standard of legal advice in this country, so I think that's a good starting point. But I think for any client or potential client, I think it's just a really individual decision, and so I think they'll know pretty quickly whether they've built up a good rapport with who they're speaking with, and I think that early discussions about what their expectations are, because it isn't the same for every family, and I think that would certainly be a mistake to sort of assume that you know how a family or a client want things run or exactly what they're seeking to obtain, because it's slightly different for everyone. So I think I would be recommending that a potential claimant has that initial discussion, is reassured that the solicitor understands what they want, and has sort of been able to explain what's realistic for them to seek from the process as well. Because managing expectations, I think, can be quite important at the outset, and not over-promising, which can perhaps be a temptation for some lawyers in order to secure the client, perhaps over-promising what they can achieve. I was hoping to ask Nikki a question, actually, really about the link between the suspicion or perhaps confirmation of substandard care, and how that fits in with their response, really, their grief reaction or a mental disorder that might follow. Is there a link between the perception of wrongdoing and the nature and extent of their reaction?
Well, I'm not speaking from the point of view of being aware of any research or any literature on that topic, but I can speak from my own personal experience. In that, I see lots of people with both grief disorders, prolonged grief disorder, which is a abnormal reaction to bereavement, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which can overlap with each other. And from my experience, I think that definitely and what people tell me when I interview them, as you say, the suspicion or sometimes the absolute knowledge that there was a mistake, that there was substandard care or that something went wrong, can definitely worsen the distress and increase symptoms of the mental disorder. And, as we were saying earlier, sometimes putting things right, as in this being identified in the inquest, being acknowledged by the defendant, being acknowledged in the settlement, that can actually be very therapeutic for the person. Usually I come into cases when the inquest has already happened, in most cases, and people will point to the findings at the inquest as being distressing, if it's been found, if the coroner, for example, thinks and points out to mistakes, but people usually know, they already know that something's gone wrong. They don't just suspect it, they know. And to have it actually acknowledged by the coroner, and then to potentially have it acknowledged in litigation, from my experience, is helpful to people. As I say, I don't get to see people in the long term, so I will see them during the course of the litigation. I don't then usually find out what happened to them, years down the line. So I'm not speaking from knowing what happened to people afterwards, but in the course of the litigation, if we've got an inquest which finds, points to wrong care, and then if we've got, for example, an acknowledgement of liability from the defendant, or even an apology sometimes from defendants during the course of the litigation, so when I'm still involved, my experience is that people will tell me that was incredibly helpful to them. It makes them sad, obviously, and people will be, but an acknowledgement that should not have happened is going to help her mental health, in my experience. Yes, absolutely.
And that ties in with the duty of candor to some extent as well, and that I often hear from families that the primary motivation for them getting in touch with a lawyer is that they feel like they haven't been spoken to honestly or candidly about what happened, and where they have perhaps been told by a member of staff, or have sort of reached their own conclusion that something's gone wrong, but they feel as if it's being obscured by the people at the hospital or the treatment provider. And I think, they often say, look, I wouldn't have wanted to get lawyers involved, but they haven't been honest. And I think, people can be surprisingly understanding when they're just given a sort of straight explanation about what happened. because I think we have a really high level of fondness for the NHS in England and Wales, and people definitely experience a sense of guilt actually pursuing a claim, and they often ask sort of whether they should be doing it, and it's something that people really grapple with, and many of them will say, look, if we had just received a clear answer at the outset, we definitely wouldn't have done this, but this has turned out to be the only way that we felt we could investigate it. I'm conscious we're obviously at we sort of hope the tail end of the most intense period of the COVID pandemic, but I'm aware that's had an impact in many ways on people who are grieving. And I was just interested in Nikki's thoughts really on sort of the realities of that and how that's impacted people, I suppose, both in terms of them specifically and practical things like not being able to see other loved ones or not being able to do their hobbies as normal, but also in terms of access to perhaps psychiatric assessment and therapies.
Yeah, I've just started seeing, just starting to come through now for me, cases which are in way or another pandemic related, either because of care that couldn't be given because of, the stress on the NHS, or cases directly related to COVID itself. So there is an impact, and some of the impact is in terms of litigation, I think, is probably related to what you were saying earlier about the way that people feel very protective towards the NHS and therefore feel guilty about litigating against hospitals and NHS bodies, and probably more so in the pandemic. People, they felt they were told protect the NHS, and now, obviously people do feel guilt at taking action against NHS organisations. So I think that's something which people have to work through in their claims. In terms of access to therapy, it's a dire situation. It really is. I mean, it was bad before the pandemic, access to therapy, any decent quality psychotherapy on the NHS, and it's just much worse now. It's something which I'm hearing from people. I've been on the waiting list since March 2020 for some CBT, and they haven't got back to me. The whole mental health system is struggling massively in the NHS. It's been underfunded for years, and that's obviously a political point. But the pandemic has made things worse, and people are not getting therapies in time when they need it. Whether it's for bereavement or whether it's for PTSD or whether it's for anything else, really. And when they do get therapy, it's often not necessarily enough. So you have people going to their GP, getting some sessions of counselling from a well-meaning counsellor, but you're not getting proper high-quality CBT, which is what you need with, people who are. We're not talking about people who are just suffering from a sort of normal, grief and need a bit of counselling and talking through. With the kind of cases we're talking about here, that the kind of people who are going to end up in litigation, you're talking about people who actually have a severe mental disorder. They're suffering from a disorder which is diagnosed and identifiable and which is susceptible to treatment. And it is important. Obviously, it's important with litigation because you're looking for a diagnosis, but it's also important in treatment to understand that obviously grief and bereavement is a normal part of life. It's everybody experiences it. It's if people have heard of sort of the supposedly normal stages of bereavement, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It's something which people know about, and you might need counselling. I mean, traditionally, obviously, you turn to your family at times of bereavement, but sometimes people find it helpful to have some counselling. But that's a very different thing from the development of an actual mental disorder as a result of a death. And it's about 1 in 10 people who will develop a mental disorder as a result of bereavement. And there's a number of different disorders which you can develop. The specific one to bereavement is called prolonged grief disorder, and that is where basically you've got you're grieving and you've lost somebody, you are you have all the reactions that you get when you're bereaved, but it goes on for longer than is normal for your society or your family or your culture, and it results in significant impairment. So it's not just that you're sad, you're bereaved, you're suffering from grief. Your life is actually being impaired, and usually you would say it goes on for more than 6 months, or if you are significantly impaired by grief, you can't function, you can't work, you're not looking after your children, whatever it is your role in life is, for more than 6 months. Then you're looking at a diagnosis of what's called prolonged grief disorder. It's a kind of a new diagnosis it's been talked about for ages, but the new ICD-11, which is the classification of diseases, the World Health Organization classification of diseases, it's for the first time it's been included in that. The ICD-11 came into force on the 1st of January this year. And prolonged grief disorder is in it after many years of people lobbying for it to be there as a specific disorder. Because previously, grief disorder kind of fell under sort of general stress-related disorders, but it didn't have a specific classification in the ICD-10. Now we've got prolonged grief disorder in the ICD-11. So that is one diagnosis. But when you lose somebody in traumatic circumstances, like an accident or a witnessed suicide or something like that, you may also get post-traumatic stress disorder, which obviously as lawyers you're very familiar with that diagnosis. And they can overlap, they can coexist, or you can have one and not the other. So you could get either of those, and you can also, of course, get a depressive disorder as a result of a bereavement. So you could have all three of them, or you could have one or two of them. And what's important about making the distinction or making the different diagnoses is that the treatment may be slightly different in an ideal world. Obviously, if you're looking for general sort of NHS treatment, you may just get the same standard CBT. But in an ideal world, you'd have specific targeted treatment. You'd have grief-related therapy, or you'd have trauma-related therapy, or you'd obviously, if you had both of those, you'd address both of those issues separately, because they're not the same thing. So it's important to make a diagnosis if you're going to identify what the correct treatment is for the disorder. And as I said earlier, it's also important to explain to people, if you have made a diagnosis, that you are suffering from a mental disorder. You're not just failing to get over it or failing to, pull yourself up by your bootlaces or whatever people may tell you. You are actually suffering from a mental disorder, which is caused by whatever the features are that cause the disorder. And there is specific treatment available for this disorder. And, people do find that very helpful to hear, that you're not just a weak person, or a person who hasn't managed, or a person who's not coping. You're a person with this disorder. This is what it's called. This is what the treatment is, and this is what the prognosis is. And I think people do find that helpful.
And from the client's perspective and from our perspective, is there anything in particular you'd recommend that we, specifically tell them ahead of the meeting? Because I'm sure lots of people are apprehensive about it, and I'm sure
everybody's apprehensive. Yes, I think. It's. I actually, you usually prepare your clients pretty well, but I work for some solicitors who, the clients, for example, are surprised that they're going to have to talk about anything other than the index event. So, and that can be very difficult. I don't think it's ever happened with your clients, but I sometimes see people and they think, okay, they're going to talk to me about, well, in this case, we talk about a death of somebody. So they're going to talk to me about the death of their loved one. And then, of course, I start asking them about their childhood and their relationship with their mother. And they are absolutely shocked and stunned and unhappy and distressed by that. So I think it's important to explain that when you're going to see a psychiatrist, of course, you're going to talk about this terrible thing that's happened to you. But the psychiatrist is going to ask you about everything in your life. They're going to talk to you about your childhood. They're going to talk to you about your marriage. They're going to talk to you about your physical health. They're going to talk to you about your children, because it's very difficult. Once somebody's now been sort of upset by the fact that I'm asking them questions they didn't expect, it's then very difficult to get a proper mental state examination, because now they're upset about something else, not the thing that we're talking about. They're upset about the fact that I'm prying into their life. So I'd say that's one of the most important things, is to say, this is a psychiatric examination. It's not just, an identification of what the issues are. That's where you do your witness statement, you explain what happened, you talk about this terrible thing that happened. But a psychiatrist is going to ask you about absolutely everything in your life, including stuff that you may think is irrelevant. Because it does happen quite a lot that I see people and they say, no, that's not relevant. And of course, I don't come back and say, well, it is actually, but I'm not going to be, mean and horrible to them and say, well, actually, it is relevant, and it's for me to say what's relevant. But people then have their backs up, and they are not, they're not going to share things in a way which is, most helpful to the examination. So I'd say that's really important, and just to explain to people that it's a thing. A psychiatric examination is a thing. You're not just chatting to somebody about something. You're not getting a little bit of counselling. You're not, speaking to me to just explain what you told your lawyer, a couple of weeks ago in more detail. It's a formalized process in which you answer questions about everything in your life, basically. And that would be probably the most helpful thing you can do. And then people know, and they're not surprised and shocked when I ask them questions which they feel to be irrelevant.
And I imagine it's quite hard to get back on track if they felt a bit ambushed at the outset.
It absolutely is. And I actually, now what I do, and have for a couple of years now, I do say to people at the beginning, we are going to talk about your life. We are going to talk about your childhood. And we are going to talk about your 3 marriages or whatever it is. And I say that at the outset, but it's still, if they haven't been prepared for that, you can see they're kind of taken aback. But it's obviously worse if you just jump in and, you're like, hello, how are you? Okay, where were you born? What was your mother like? And people can get very, very defensive. And then sometimes you can't actually, some people refuse to talk, of course, and that's fine. And sometimes people say, I'm not going to answer that question. And my answer is, that's fine. You don't have to answer any question. It's not mandatory. It's just the questions you do answer help me to write my report and to help your lawyer in the case. But it's that I think would be one of the most important things in terms of preparing the client, and just making sure that they know what's going to happen, that it's going to take about 2 hours. It's not going to be a 10-minute conversation. It's going to take 2 or 3 hours. So they need to be ready for that. And that they might afterwards not feel very good. And they might feel that they need to be with somebody, that they need to phone somebody, that they need to talk to someone. So maybe, alert someone in their life that they might want to talk to them afterwards, I'd say. That would probably be, a good piece of advice, and that it's not going to be a pleasant experience. It's interesting. Some people actually do find it. I've had people say to me, this is the first time I've ever spoken about this awful thing that happened, and it's been really helpful. It's been therapeutic. It's been good to speak. Thank you so much for listening. I get that. I also get people, obviously, who are distressed beyond belief and absolutely find it the most awful process, and they really are so upset and distressed at having to talk about the things in their life, that they don't want to. So you get both ends of it, actually.
There's some great insights from Nikki and Ali as well, about how families go through this incredibly difficult process. It's a really important process to ensure that lessons are learned by medical institutions or whoever else might be responsible for a death in these kind of circumstances.
Thank you very much for listening to Legal Thinking. If you would like to hear more discussions like this, you can subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more information about us, you can go to roydswithieking.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.